The last topic we're going to cover in Module 2 is a quick overview of the two major economic systems that we find in industrial societies, so modern societies. Um, uh, those two systems are capitalism and socialism. I think it's really important to have a good understanding of both economic systems, even though in the United States, obviously, we're mostly going to be focusing on the operation of capitalism, which is the economic system that we find ourselves closest to. To be scrupulously fair, most economic systems in um, what we might call the core nations are in some form or another mixed economies. So in the United States, we have an economy that's mostly close to capitalism relative to, say, some European societies, which might be a little bit closer to socialism. But socialist economies in places like Sweden and Norway contain significant elements of capitalism within them, and in the United States, there are some sectors of the economic system that are either um, strictly regulated by government, or in some cases actually run by government. Not that many, but things like the Veterans Administration is an example of a government-run healthcare system. The public school system is a government-run system of public education. So there are some elements of the U.S. economy that, at the very least, have been socialized, if not outright socialist in nature, but mostly capitalism. So we're going to talk a little bit about the core elements of both. I'm going to go into a little bit of a deeper dive on capitalism when we go into the next module, but since we're currently talking about social structure, and the next unit is going to be focusing on the operation of economic systems, both in relation to stratification and inequality overall, but also specifically the way in which race and ethnicity and sex and gender are also sort of reflected in the system of inequality in the United States. It's just a good idea for people to have a basic understanding of what we mean by these two different kinds of economic systems. So when we talk about capitalism, we're talking about an economic system that's based on private ownership of the relations of production. So property that is used to create productive outputs like goods and services that are sold in markets. So the means to accomplish that are owned privately by individuals, by families, by people who purchase shares and stocks as private citizens. So private ownership as opposed to public or government ownership, right? So the core elements of capitalism include that private ownership and private control of investment, but also profits for capitalists as the chief motivators of economic investments. So economic activity in a capitalist system is driven by a desire to maximize profits. All of the other outputs and byproducts of capitalist activity are kind of just that. They're byproducts. The main purpose of capitalism is to generate profit for capitalists, not necessarily to provide goods and services to people. Goods and services to people are the means through which capitalists generate profit, but that's the main focus. The production of goods and services, what gets produced, how much of it gets produced, ultimately, even things like pricing for those commodities, that is a function of markets. So there are markets for exchange, in which we look at the dynamic of supply and demand. And there are markets for labor, in which we can also look at the dynamic of supply and demand. A couple of things to keep in mind. And again, we're going to go much more in depth in this when we get into the next module. But demand for a product or a service is going to drive the price up. Supply of that product or service is going to result in lowering prices. So that's the dynamic of supply and demand as it works in these marketplaces. So marketplaces for production of goods and services, but also marketplaces for labor as a commodity. The reason why companies move production overseas when they can is because labor costs there are lower than they are, say, for example, in the United States. Lower labor costs mean increased profit because you're spending less to produce a good or a service. That means you capture more of the total sale price of that item in profit as opposed to production cost. And then the last element of capitalism is revolves around the role of the state. And by the way, just for your information, when we say state, we are usually talking about the nation state, not Illinois or Wisconsin or Indiana. So when we talk about the role of the state, we're talking about the role of government. We're talking about the role of usually the federal government when it comes to economic systems. So this last feature of capitalism, which revolves around the role of the state, is that it is a laissez-faire approach. Laissez-faire is French for let it be, which kind of means a kind of hands-off approach. The idea is that government doesn't need to intervene in the operation of the economic system because the markets in capitalism will provide a mechanism to correct for problems in production, problems and inefficiencies will ultimately get kind of weeded out. So again, we're going to go much more in depth on that, but I want you to be aware of those four features, right? Private ownership and control of investment. Profit motivates economic investments by capitalists. Markets exist for exchange, but markets also exist for labor. And the role of the state is essentially let it be, laissez-faire. Socialism emerges a bit later. So capitalism emerges incrementally over a period of about a century. Arguably, it begins in the 1600s. Maybe some case could be made for the late 1500s. Some people might argue something later in the 1600s, maybe even early 1700s. It's, there's not like a bright sunny day when they cut a ribbon and said, now we're a capitalist. But capitalism emerges, historically speaking, in the 17th and 18th century, right? The 1600s and 1700s. It's initially kind of small scale. We don't have factories. We don't have large scale production. It doesn't look like capitalism was as we understand it today, or even as we understood it, say, for example, during the Victorian era in the late 1800s in the United States in the era of the robber barons and these giant factories belching, smoke into the sky and, 15-hour work days and the horrors of the meatpacking industry as described in Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. That capitalism certainly comes into existence, but that isn't what exists at the beginning. At the beginning, it's small merchants, it's families who engage in economic activity in the context of their home. Before the mid to late 1700s, the primary unit of economic production in society was the family, was the household. The externalization of capitalist production doesn't really begin until, as I said, the 1700s. That's when we begin to see the emergence of factories. We begin to see the emergence of industrial capitalism. So we'll talk about that again, but I want you guys to understand that this system's been around for a while, whereas socialism is relatively new. Socialism begins to emerge in response to some of the excesses of capitalism as they start to emerge in the 1800s. So when Marx writes his critique of capital in the mid-1800s, this is kind of a rising sort of set of political philosophies that are attacking what they see as kind of the excesses of capitalism. So kind of a reactive sort of response and an imagining of a different kind of economic system. Socialism actually has some core elements as well. They are not surprisingly different than the core elements of capitalism. Socialism's core elements include public ownership of the means of production. So the state, the government, and in a democracy, of course, that means the people, own the materials, own the factories, own the places where production occurs. So it might take the form of like workers owning the place of business, right? So a factory that's run by the workers in the factory, not the some capitalist. So public ownership of the means of production is the first and I think most important feature of socialism. Um, and it's important that you guys keep that in mind because when political conversations sort of devolve into sort of the inevitable socialism and cries of socialism, it's genuinely exasperating for people who know what that means, right? So um, if what we're talking about is not public ownership of a company, right? The government owns a company and manufactures products or creates services. It's not socialism, right? It's just not. Definitionally, it can't be. So that's the first thing, right? Public ownership of the means of production. The second feature of socialism is an emphasis on egalitarianism. The emphasis could be on opportunity, it could be on outcome, but the idea is that production occurs in a way that is designed to create the greatest degree of egalitarian outcomes or opportunities as possible, rather than economic activity being generated by a desire to pursue profit. Economic activity is organized around providing goods and services for people in reflection of the need they have for those goods and services. That leads to the third feature of socialism, which is an emphasis on collective or community interests, right? So the presence of inequality is seen as an indictment of a lack of ability to sort of effectively and fairly distribute resources within a society. The emphasis is going to be on what's good for us collectively, as opposed to what might be good for an individual entrepreneur or capitalist. The fourth element at the core of socialism is an emphasis on planning, right? So if we have a publicly owned company that is generating, say, for example, clothing, or even better, energy. Let's look at energy production. So the amount of energy a person has in the United States is a function of how much they can afford to buy. And markets will produce as much energy as there is demand for energy. In a socialist system, we would produce as much energy as we need to be able to keep people's homes lighted and be able to run their computers, allowing them to access the internet and do laundry and wash their dishes and take showers and all that, right? So we're not going to produce a surplus of electricity or natural gas or whatever other kind of energy we're using. We're going to produce as much as we need. But in order to determine how much we need, there has to be planning. You have to figure out like what is the average square footage of a home, and how much energy should that house have allotted for it, because we don't want to waste shared or collective resources by overproducing. We also don't want to leave anybody out by underproducing. So rather than produce a surplus and then hope that the market kind of gobbles it up, which might be the case in capitalism. In socialism, there's a much more extensive network of agencies and oversight structures that are designed to sort of help plan how to use the productive capacity of a society's economic system. And then finally, the last element of socialism is that it requires democratic oversight in order to establish accountability, right? If our economic system is publicly owned, then public oversight of our shared economic system requires that we be participating in the decision-making process. It could be representative democracy, it could be direct democracy, it could be, any number of different democratic structures. But if your society is not democratic, it is also not socialist, right? A state-owned mechanism of production in the absence of democratic input could be a lot of different things. It could be fascist, it could be monarchist, it could be a lot of different things, but it's not socialist, right? Socialist sort of requires that social element. That's, again, part of the definition. So those are the two major economic systems. As I said, if you look at modern societies, you're not going to find a pure socialist system in existence. You're not going to find a pure capitalist system in existence. What you're going to find is a kind of continuum with socialism on one end, capitalism on the other, and then various societies' economies can be plotted sort of on a line between those two. And if you look at that continuum, the United States is closer to capitalism. Sweden, Denmark, Norway, places like that are closer to socialism. I will say, just for the record, that the United States is closer to capitalism than Sweden is to socialism, right? So the clustering of states, the clustering of nation states is closer to the capitalist end of the continuum. But again, right, capitalism's been around for a while. That was a system that's been informing the development and the operation of nation states for a couple hundred years now. Socialism's still relatively new, and it remains to be seen, whether it is sort of inevitable or just another of different options that have kind of become available. I certainly have a set of ideas on what I think about that. But again, this class is more of an introductory level survey approach. So we're not probably going to spend much time talking about socialism, in part because our analysis of stratification and inequality is going to be centered on conditions in the United States. And so, given that the United States is a capitalist system, we're going to look at the operation of capitalism, and specifically how it plays a role in creating and maintaining stratification and economic inequality. So that is it for Module 2, and I will see you guys next time.